My name is Alina Vance, and for the last 5 years I have been the invisible ghost at my own family's dinner table. As I sat in the plush, velvet chair of the Oakwood Heights Country Club, the air smelled of expensive perfume and stifling arrogance. Across from me, my sister Juliana was twirling a glass of vintage Bordeaux, her diamond-encrusted watch catching the light as she gestured wildly. She was narrating her latest triumph as a senior director at Blackwood Capital, and my parents were hanging onto every word as if she were delivering the Sermon on the Mount. My father, a man who measured worth in zip codes and Ivy League degrees, leaned forward, his face glowing with a pride I hadn't seen directed at me since I was 10 years old. Then the inevitable happened. The spotlight shifted, not to shine on me, but to burn me. My mother's voice, sharp and laced with a pity that felt like a slap, sliced through the clinking of silverware. She asked if I was still wasting my life on that little internet hobby in the guest house. I looked down at my salad, hiding the spark in my eyes. They saw a 30-year-old failure in a thrift store sweater. They saw a girl who spent 14 hours a day staring at code, someone they thought was barely making rent. What they didn't know was that the hobby they mocked was actually Ethereus, a global financial infrastructure that had quietly become the central nervous system of the modern stock market. While Juliana was busy climbing the corporate ladder, I had built the mountain she was standing on. My phone vibrated in my pocket, a silent alert from my chief operations officer. The merger is finalized. We now own 60% of the North American banking protocols. Current valuation, $1.2 billion. Juliana let out a condescending laugh, her eyes scanning my quiet demeanor. She told the table that it was cute how I tried to work from home, but that in the real world, people had responsibilities. She even joked that maybe I could manage her Instagram account if I needed some extra cash. My father cleared his throat, the sound of a judge delivering a sentence. He told me that they had decided to stop enabling my delusions. They were giving me 30 days to vacate the guest house and find a real job, perhaps as an assistant in Juliana's firm. He said they were doing this for my own good, to teach me the value of a dollar. I felt a lump in my throat, not of sadness, but of the sheer irony. The very roof over their heads, the club we were sitting in, even the firm Juliana worked for, I had my fingerprints on all of it. I took a slow, deliberate sip of water. I realized that the people who were supposed to know me best didn't know me at all. They loved the idea of success, but they were blind to the person actually achieving it. My mother sighed, telling me that it was time to stop playing pretend on the computer. I looked at her, really looked at her, and realized the experiment was over. I had spent years living in the shadows to see if they would ever love me for who I was, not what I earned. The answer was a deafening no. I reached into my bag and pulled out my titanium laptop, the matte black surface looking like a weapon against the white linen tablecloth. My father frowned, telling me to put that toy away, that this wasn't the time for my blogs. I looked him dead in the eye and told him that he was right. It wasn't time for a blog. It was time for a reckoning. As the screen of my laptop hummed to life, the bright glow reflected in my father's stunned eyes. I didn't show them a website or a social media feed. I pulled up the live global heat map of Ethereus. Thousands of glowing blue lines pulsed across the globe like a digital heartbeat, representing trillions of dollars in transactions flowing through my code. I pointed to the glowing number in the corner, the real-time valuation of the company. Juliana leaned in, her smirk faltering as she squinted at the screen. She whispered that it had to be a mistake, that the number had too many zeros. I told her that it wasn't a mistake, it was $1.2 billion. And then I dropped the second bomb. I asked her how the Project Titan launch went at Blackwood Capital this morning, her face drained of all color. She stammered that it was the biggest day of her career, the new software that was going to revolutionize their trading floor. I leaned back, my voice calm and steady, and told her that Project Titan was mine. Ethereus had developed the core API that her entire firm now relied on. I wasn't just some girl playing on the internet. I was the architect of the system that allowed her to do her job. My mother's hand trembled, her fork clattering onto the fine china. She started to say that this was impossible, that I was just a girl living in their guest house. I let out a soft, sad laugh. I told her that I stayed in that guest house because I wanted to see if my family cared more about my presence or my prestige. I told them about the 3-story penthouse I owned overlooking the skyline, a place I had lived in for the last 2 years while letting them believe I was struggling. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with the sound of their world collapsing. My father, always the pragmatist, tried to regain control of the conversation. He cleared his throat and asked why I would hide something like this, why I would let them worry. I looked him in the eye and asked if he was truly worried about me or if he was just embarrassed by me. I reminded him of the Christmas 2 years ago when he told me not to come to the charity gala because my lifestyle didn't fit the family image. I told him that I was the anonymous donor who had written the $500,000 check to save that charity when it was on the brink of folding. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The pride he had felt for his successful daughter, Juliana, was being eroded by the sheer scale of my reality. My phone buzzed again. It was a high-priority notification from my legal team. I turned the screen toward Juliana. It was a formal notice of a hostile takeover bid for Blackwood Capital's technology division. I watched her eyes widen as she read the document. I told her that by the time she walked into the office tomorrow morning, she wouldn't be reporting to her current CEO. She would be reporting to the board of Etherius, which meant, in no uncertain terms, she was now working for me. The smugness that had defined her entire personality for decades evaporated in an instant. She looked like a child who had realized the floor was actually lava. She looked at our parents, searching for some kind of defense, but they were too busy staring at me as if I were a stranger they had just met for the first time. The atmosphere at the table shifted from suffocating pity to a cold, clinical reality. My mother tried to reach for my hand, her voice suddenly sweet, calling me sweetie and claiming they always knew I had a spark of genius. I pulled my hand back before she could touch me. The hypocrisy felt like a physical weight in the room. I told her to stop, that the sweetie who lived in the guest house was apparently a disappointment, but the CEO sitting here now was someone she wanted to claim. I asked her if she remembered the night of her birthday last month, when I offered to take the family to dinner, and she told me not to worry about it because the bill would be too high for my budget. I told her that while she was eating her affordable dinner, I was closing a deal that could have bought this entire country club 10 times over. My father's professional mask began to crumble. He started talking about investment strategies and how we could pool the family resources to take Etherius even further. It was pathetic. He didn't see a daughter, he saw a golden goose he had accidentally tried to cook. I opened a new tab on my laptop, displaying the deed to their estate and the mortgage records for Juliana's luxury condo. I watched their faces turn a ghostly shade of white as they saw the holding company name at the top, Vance Legacy Holdings. I explained to them that 3 years ago, when the market crashed and their private bankers were panicking, a silent partner had stepped in to buy up their debt and keep them afloat. I told them that I was that partner. They hadn't been living on their own success, they had been living on my mercy. Juliana was hyperventilating now, her phone clutched in her hand like a lifeline that had been cut. She whispered, Why did you keep us in the dark?" I looked at her, and for the first time, I let the anger show. I told her it was because I wanted to see who they were when they thought I had nothing to offer them. I wanted to see if they would still love the girl who just did things on the internet, and I got my answer. Every snide comment, every missed invitation, every real job lecture was a brick in the wall I built between us. I told her that she had spent her life making me feel small so she could feel tall, never realizing that I was the one holding the ladder she was standing on. Just then, my personal assistant, Marcus, appeared at the entrance of the dining room. He didn't look like a country club member, he looked like a man who moved mountains. He walked straight to our table, ignoring the stunned gasps of the other members who recognized him from the covers of business magazines. He bowed slightly and handed me a secure tablet. "The board of Blackwood Capital has conceded Ms. Vance," he said, his voice carrying just enough to be heard by my family. "The restructuring of the tech division begins at 8:00 a.m. Also, your jet is fueled and ready for the London summit." I thanked him and sent him to wait at the car. The silence that followed his departure was absolute. My family looked at me, and for the first time in 32 years, they looked afraid. I stood up, the chair scraping against the floor, and told them that the tough love they wanted to give me was no longer necessary. I told them it was time I showed them what real power looked like. I stood at the head of the table, no longer the quiet daughter picking at a salad, but the most powerful person in the room. I told them to get up. I told them that if they wanted to understand the real job I had been doing, they needed to see the reality of it. We walked out of the club in a daze, my parents and Juliana stumbling behind me like ghosts. Waiting at the curb wasn't the beat-up sedan they thought I drove. It was a fleet of 3 black, armored SUVs, their engines idling with a low, predatory hum. A security detail in crisp suits opened the doors, and the club manager, a man who usually ignored my parents, bowed deeply as I passed. "Safe travels, Ms. Vance," he murmured. The look on my father's face was pure bewilderment. He had spent 40 years trying to get that man to remember his name, yet here he was, subservient to the daughter he had just tried to evict. We drove in silence toward the city's financial district. As we approached the tallest skyscraper in the skyline, the Vancy Thurius logo glowed in brilliant white neon at the very summit. Juliana whispered that she thought that building was owned by a foreign conglomerate. I told her that she was right, it was. A conglomerate I founded in Singapore 5 years ago to keep my name off the local radar. We entered through a private underground garage and took a high-speed elevator directly to the top. When the doors opened, my family stepped out into a world they didn't know existed. It wasn't an office, it was a command center. Floor-to-ceiling glass walls revealed the entire city sparkling below us. Dozens of engineers and analysts were still at their desks, and as I walked through, every single one of them stood up. "Good evening, Ms. Vance," they said in unison. I led my stunned family into my private office. On the wall hung a series of framed photographs, me shaking hands with world leaders, me receiving the Innovator of the Decade award, and a picture of me at 25, sitting in that very guest house with a single laptop and a box of ramen. My mother walked over to a display case holding a collection of rare, ancient coins. She asked if these were real. I told her they were worth more than her entire jewelry collection. I watched her hand retreat as if the glass were hot. She looked around the room, her eyes finally landing on a small, framed to-do list from 5 years ago. At the top, in my messy handwriting, were the words, "Build a world they can't ignore." I sat behind my desk, a slab of polished obsidian, and looked at Juliana. I told her to open the folder sitting on the edge of the desk. With trembling fingers, she did. It was her new employment contract. I hadn't fired her, but I had stripped her of her autonomy. Her new role was Internal Relations Liaison. Essentially, she would be the one explaining my company's policies to the very people she used to look down on. I told her she could accept it, or she could leave and try to find a job in an industry that I now controlled. The choice was hers. She looked at our father, but he was staring out the window at the city, finally realizing that the daughter he thought was a failure was actually the one keeping the lights on in every building he could see. I told them that the guest house was being renovated starting tomorrow. Not for me, but for a local charity that provides housing for young women in tech. I told them it was time they moved back into the main house and started paying their own property taxes, because as of midnight, my secret support was officially over. The silence in my office was different from the silence at the country club. At the club, the silence was born of shame. Here it was born of awe. My mother finally spoke, her voice a fragile thread, asking how I could live two lives for so long. She asked if I ever felt lonely in my success. I looked at her and felt a final, lingering spark of sadness. I told her that I wasn't lonely because of the work. I was lonely because every time I achieved something monumental, I knew I couldn't tell my own mother because she would either laugh or ask when I was going to get a real career. I told her that the greatest tragedy of my life wasn't the struggle to build a billion-dollar company. It was the realization that my family only valued people who looked successful, not people who actually were. My father walked toward me, his hand outstretched as if to finally acknowledge me as an equal. I didn't take it. Instead, I stood up and walked toward the massive glass window. Below us, the city lights looked like a circuit board, and I knew exactly how every pulse of data moved through those streets. I told them that tomorrow, the world would find out who owns Etherius. The press release was already scheduled. My name would be on every financial news ticker from New York to Tokyo. I told them they could either be the family that stands beside me, humbled and ready to truly listen, or they could continue to be the family that chases shadows and status. But the tough love was over. From now on, the terms of our relationship would be written by me. Juliana looked at her contract one last time and signed it. She didn't have a choice, and we both knew it. But as she handed it back, I saw a flicker of something new in her eyes, respect. It was a respect earned through power, which was the only language she understood, but it was a start. I told them that the cars were waiting downstairs to take them back to their house. I told them to enjoy the view from their balcony tonight, because for the first time in 5 years, they were looking at a world where they weren't the ones in charge. As they walked toward the elevator, my mother turned back, a tear finally escaping her eye. She asked if I would come for Sunday dinner next week. I leaned against my desk, the glow of a dozen monitors illuminating my face. I told her that I would come, but not to the country club. We would eat at a small diner I used to go to when I was broke and starting out. If they could handle sitting in a plastic booth and eating a $5 burger without complaining, then maybe, just maybe, we could start over. They nodded, defeated but hopeful, and the elevator doors slid shut. I stood alone in my empire, the hum of the servers a comforting song in the background. I realized then that the best revenge wasn't the money, the skyscraper, or the takeover. The best revenge was the peace of knowing I had built a world so big that their small-mindedness could no longer touch me. I picked up my phone, dialed my CFO, and told him to greenlight the next acquisition. I was just getting started.